15. Nahri. Nahri glanced behind her, but the boat was already leaving, the captain singing as he returned to the open lake. She took a deep breath and followed Dara and the Ayanle merchants as they made their way to the enormous doors flanked by a pair of winged lion statues set in the brass wall. The docks were otherwise deserted and in a state of disrepair. She picked her way carefully through the crumbling monuments, catching sight of a gray hawk watching them from high atop one of the statue's shoulders. "This place looks like Hierapolis," she whispered. The decaying grandeur and deathly silence made it hard to believe there was a teeming city behind the high brass walls. Dara cast a dismayed glance at a collapsed pier. "It was much grander in my day," he agreed. "The Gaziri never had much taste in the finer aspects of life. I doubt they care about upkeep." He lowered his voice. "And I don't think the docks get much use. I've not seen another Deva in years. I assumed most people became too afraid to travel after the Nahids were wiped out." He gave her a small smile. "Maybe now that will change." She didn't return his smile. The idea that her presence might be reason enough to renew commerce was daunting. The heavy iron doors opened as their group approached. A few men milled about the entrance, soldiers from the look of them. All wore white waist wraps that went down to their calves, black sleeveless tunics, and dark gray turbans. They shared the same bronze-brown skin and black beards as the boat captain. She watched as one nodded to the merchants and motioned them inside. "Are they Gaziris?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the long spears held by two of the men. Their scythed points had a coppery gleam. "Yes, the Royal Guard." Dara took a deep breath, self-consciously touching the muddied mark on his temple. "Let's go." The guards seemed preoccupied with the merchants, poking through their salt tablets and scouring their scrolls with pursed lips. One guard glanced up at them, his gunmetal gray gaze briefly flickering past her face. "Pilgrims?" he asked, sounding bored. Dara kept his gaze low. "Yes, from Sark." The guard waved him off. "Go," he said distractedly, nearly knocking Nahri over as he turned to help his fellows with the long-suffering salt traders. Nahri blinked, surprised by how easily that had gone. "Come on," Dara whispered, tugging her forward. "Before they change their minds." They slipped through the open doors. As the full force of the city hit her, Nahri realized the walls must have held sound in as well as magic, because they were standing in the loudest, most chaotic place she'd ever seen, surrounded by waves of jostling people. Nahri tried to peer over their heads to look down the crowded street. "What is this place?" Dara glanced around. "The Grand Bazaar, I believe. We had ours in the same location." "Bazaar?" She gave the frenzied scene a dubious glance. Cairo had bazaars. This looked more like a cross between a riot and the Hajj. And it wasn't so much the number of people that astounded her, but the variety. Pure-blooded djinn strode through the crowds, their odd and ephemeral grace marking their difference among the mob of more human-looking shafit. Their attire was wild, literally. In one case, she saw a man pass by with an enormous python settled over his shoulders, like a contented pet. People wore glowing robes the color of turmeric and dresses like wound-up sheets held together by shells and razor-sharp teeth. There were headdresses of glittering stones and wigs of braided metals, capes of bright feathers, and at least one robe that looked like a skinned crocodile, its toothy mouth resting on its wearer's shoulder. A spindly man with an enormous smoking beard ducked by, and a girl holding a basket swept past Nahri, bumping her with one hip. The girl briefly glanced back, letting her gaze linger appreciatively on Dara. A spark of annoyance lit in Nahri, and one of the girl's long black braids let out a wriggle like a stretching snake. Nahri jumped. Dara, meanwhile, just looked irritated. He eyed the bustling crowd with open displeasure, giving the muddy street an unimpressed sniff. "Come," he said, pulling her forward. "We'll attract attention if we just stand here gawking." But it was impossible not to gawk as they pushed their way through the crowd. The stone street was wide, lined with dozens of market stalls and unevenly stacked buildings. A dizzying maze of covered alleys snaked off the main avenue, crowded with foul heaps of decaying garbage and stacked crates. The air was ripe with the smell of coal and cooking aromas. Djinn shouted and gossiped all around her. Vendors hawked their wares while customers haggled. Nahri couldn't identify half of what was being sold. Hairy purple melons quivered and trembled beside ordinary oranges and dark cherries, while midnight black nuggets the size of fists were piled between cashews and pistachios. Bolts of giant folded rose petals scented the air between those of patterned silk and sturdy muslin, and a jewelry merchant swung a pair of earrings toward her, painted glass eyes that seemed to wink. A stout woman in a bright purple chador poured a smoking white liquid into several different braziers, and a little boy with fiery hair tried to coax a golden bird twice his size from a rattan cage. Nahri nervously edged away. She'd had her fill of large birds. "Where's the Grand Temple?" she asked, dodging a puddle of iridescent water. Before Dara could answer, a man peeled off from the crowd and planted himself in front of them. He was dressed in stone-colored trousers and a close-fitting crimson tunic that reached his knees. A matching flat cap was perched upon his black hair. "May the fires burn brightly for you both," he greeted them in Devasti. "Did I hear you say the Grand Temple? You are pilgrims, yes? Here to pay devotion to the glory of our dear departed Nahids?" His flowery words were so obviously recited that Nahri could only smile in recognition. A fellow hustler. She looked him over, noting his black eyes and sharp golden cheekbones. He was clean-shaven save for a neat black mustache. A Deva con artist. "I can take you to the Grand Temple," he continued. "I have a cousin with a little tavern. Very fair prices for the rooms." Dara shoved past the man. "I know the way. But there is still the matter of accommodation," the man persisted, hurrying to keep up with them. "Pilgrims from the countryside tend not to realize how dangerous Daevabad can be." "Ah, and I bet you get a handsome cut from this cousin of yours with such fair prices," Nahri said knowingly. The man's smile vanished. "Are you working with Gushnap?" He planted himself in front of them again and squared his shoulders. "I told him," he said, wagging a finger in her face. "This is my territory and—" "Ah!" he shrieked as Dara seized him by his collar and yanked him away from Nahri. "Let him go," she hissed. But the Deva man had already caught sight of the muddied mark on Dara's cheek. The color left his face, and he let out a muffled squeal as Dara lifted him off the ground. "Dara!" Nahri felt a sudden prick behind her ears, the sensation of being watched. She abruptly straightened up and looked over her shoulder. Her eyes met the curious gray gaze of a djinn across the street. He appeared to be Gaziri and was dressed casually in a simple gray robe and turban. But there was a certain erectness to his posture that she didn't like. As she stared at him, he turned to a nearby stall as if browsing its wares. It was then that Nahri saw the bizarre crowd was thinning. A few nervous faces disappeared down adjoining alleys, and a copper merchant across the way slammed his metal screen shut. Nahri frowned. She'd lived through enough violence, the power struggles of various Ottomans, the French invasion, to recognize the quiet tension that overtook a city before it erupted. Windows were being latched and doors pulled closed. A woman shouted for a pair of dawdling children, and an elderly man limped down an alley. Behind her, Dara was threatening to rip the con artist's lungs from his chest if he ever saw him again. She touched his shoulder. "We need to—" Her warning was interrupted by a sudden clang. Down the avenue, a soldier used his scythe to strike a large set of brass cymbals strung from two opposing rooftops. "Curfew!" he cried. Dara let go of the hustler and the man fled. "Curfew?" Nahri could feel the tension of the remaining crowd with every hurried heartbeat. Something's going on here. Something we know nothing about. A quick glance showed her that the Gaziri man she'd caught spying was gone. She grabbed Dara's hand. "Let's go." She caught snatches of whispers as they hurried through the emptying bazaar. "That's what people are saying. Kidnapped in the dead of night from their marriage bed. Gathering in the Medan. The Most High only knows what they think they're going to accomplish." "The Devas don't care," she heard. "The fire worshippers get whatever they want. They always do." Dara tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her through the crush of people. They crossed through a tall ornamental gate to enter a large plaza enclosed by copper walls gone green with age. It was less crowded than the bazaar, but there were at least a few hundred djinn milling about the simple fountain of black and white marble blocks at the plaza's center. The massive archway they had passed under was unadorned, but 6 other smaller gates fronted the plaza, each decorated in a widely different style. Djinn, looking far better dressed and wealthier than the shafit in the bazaar, were vanishing through them. As she watched, a pair of flame-haired children chased each other through a gate of fluted columns with grapevines winding its length. A tall Ayanle man pushed past her, headed for a gate marked by 2 narrow studded pyramids. 6 gates for 6 tribes, she realized, as well as a gate for the bazaar. Dara pushed her toward the one directly across the plaza. The Deva gate was painted pale blue and held open by 2 brass statues of winged lions. A single Gaziri guard stood there, clutching his coppery scythe as he tried to shepherd the nervous crowd through. An angry voice caught her attention as they approached the fountain. "And what do you get for standing up for the faithful, for helping the needy and oppressed? Death! A gruesome death, while our king hides behind the trousers of his fire-worshipping Grand Wazir." A djinn man dressed in a dirty brown robe and sweat-stained white turban had climbed on top of the fountain and was shouting to a growing group of men gathered below. He gestured angrily at the Deva gate. "Look, my brothers!" the man shouted again. "Even now they are favored, guarded by the king's own soldiers. And this, after they've stolen an innocent new bride from the bed of her believing husband. A woman whose only crime was leaving her family's superstitious cult. Is this just?" The crowd waiting to enter the Deva quarter grew, edging out toward the fountain. The 2 groups were mostly staying apart and giving each other wary glances, but Nahri saw a young Deva man turn, looking annoyed. "It is just," the young Deva argued back loudly. "This is our city. Why don't you leave our women alone and crawl back to whatever human hovel your dirt blood came from?" "Dirt blood?" the man on the fountain repeated. He climbed to a higher block so that he was more visible to the crowd. "Is that what you think I am?" Not waiting for an answer, he produced a long knife from his belt and dragged it down his wrist. Several people in the crowd gasped as the man's dark blood dripped and sizzled. "Does this look like dirt to you? I passed the veil. I am as djinn as you." The Deva man was not deterred. Instead, he stepped closer to the fountain, anger brewing in his black eyes. "That foul human word has no meaning for me," he snapped. "This is Daevabad. Those who would call themselves djinn have no place here, nor do their shop-feet spawn." Nahri pressed closer to Dara. "Sounds like you have a friend," she muttered darkly. He scowled but said nothing. "Your people are a disease," the shop-feet man yelled. "A degenerate bunch of slavers still worshipping a family of inbred murderers." Dara hissed, and his fingers grew hot on her wrist. "Don't," Nahri whispered. "Just keep going." But the insult clearly angered the Deva crowd that remained, and more of them turned toward the fountain. A gray-haired old man defiantly raised an iron cudgel. "The Nahids were Suleiman's chosen. The Khatanis are nothing but Gaziri sandflies, filthy barbarians speaking the language of snakes." The shop-feet man opened his mouth to respond and then stopped, raising a hand to his ear. "Do you hear that?" He grinned, and the crowd went quiet. In the distance, she could hear chanting coming from the direction of the bazaar. The ground started to tremble, echoing with the pounding feet of a growing throng of marchers. The man laughed as the Deva started to nervously back away, the threat of a mob apparently enough to convince them to flee. "Run! Go huddle at your fire altars and beg your dead Nahids to save you." More men poured into the plaza, anger in their faces. Nahri didn't see many swords, but enough were armed with kitchen knives and broken furniture to alarm her. "This will be your day of reckoning," the man shouted. "We will tear through your homes until we find the girl, until we find and free every believing slave you infidels hold." She and Dara were the last through the gate. Dara made sure she was past the brass lions and then turned to argue with the Gaziri guard. "Did you not hear them?" He gestured at the growing mob. "Close the gate." "I cannot," the soldier replied. He looked young, his beard little more than black fuzz. "These gates never close. It's against the law. Besides, reinforcements are coming." He swallowed nervously, clutching his scythe. "There's nothing to worry about." Nahri didn't buy his false optimism, and as the chanting grew louder, the soldier's gray eyes widened. Though she couldn't hear the djinn instigator over the shouts of the crowd, She saw him gesticulate to the mob of men below. He pointed defiantly at the Deva gate, and a roar went through them. Nahri's heart raced. Deva men and women, young and old, were rushing down the manicured streets and vanishing into the pretty stone buildings surrounding them. About a dozen men worked to quickly seal doors and windows, their bare hands the bright crimson of a blacksmith's tools. But they'd only completed about half the buildings, and the mob was close. Farther down the street, a toddler wailed as its mother pounded desperately on a locked door. Something hardened in Dara's face. Before Nahri could do anything, he snatched the scythe away from the Gaziri soldier and shoved him to the ground. "Useless dog." Dara gave the doors a half-hearted tug, and when they didn't budge, he sighed, sounding more irritated than worried. He turned toward the crowd. Nahri panicked. "Dara, I don't think—" He ignored her and crossed the plaza toward the mob, twisting the scythe in his hands as if to test the weapon's weight. With the rest of the Devas behind the gate, he was alone, a single man facing hundreds. The sight must have struck the crowd as amusing. Nahri caught sight of a few puzzled faces and heard laughter. The Shafi'd man hopped down from the fountain with a grin. "Can it be? Is there at least one fire worshipper with some courage?" Dara shaded his eyes with one hand and pointed the scythe at the crowd with the other. "Tell that rabble to go home. No one is tearing through any Deva homes today." "We have cause," the man insisted. "Your people stole back a convert woman." "Go home," Dara repeated. Without waiting for a response, he turned back toward the gate. At Nahri's side, one of the winged lions seemed to shudder. She startled, but when she glanced over, the statue was still. "Or what?" The Shafi'd man started after Dara. Still standing with his back to the crowd, Dara caught Nahri's eye as he pulled off the turban that partially covered his face. "Get back, Nahri," he said, wiping off the mud that concealed his tattoo. "Let me handle this." "Handle it?" Nahri kept her voice low, but anxiety swelled inside her. "Did you not hear the guard? There are soldiers coming." He shook his head. "They're not here now, and I've seen enough Devas killed in my lifetime." He turned back toward the mob. Nahri heard a few gasps of disbelief from the men nearest them, and then whispers began to race through the crowd. The Shafi'd man burst into laughter. "Oh, you poor soul! What in God's name have you done to your face? You think you're an Afshin?" A stout man, twice Dara's size, in a blacksmith's apron, stepped forward. "He has slave eyes," he said dismissively. "He's obviously deranged. Who but a madman would wish to be one of those demons? He raised an iron hammer. Step aside, fool, or be struck down first. Slave or not, you're still only one man. I am only one man, aren't I? How kind of you to share your concerns. Perhaps we should even the odds. Dara waved his hands toward the gate. Nahri's first thought was that he motioned for her, which, while flattering, was a deeply flawed estimation of her abilities. But then the brass lion at her side shivered. She backed away as it stretched, the metal groaning as the statue arched its back like a house cat. The one on the other side of the gate shook out its wings, opened its mouth, and roared. Nahri wouldn't have thought any sound could rival the terror-inducing howl of the Marid's river serpent, but these came close. The first lion cried back to its fellow just as loudly, a horrible growl mixed with the grating of rocks that shook her to her core. It belched a fiery plume of smoke, like coughing up a hairball, and then strolled toward Dara with a sinewy grace completely at odds with its metal form. Judging from the screams of the mob, Nahri suspected animating winged lions that breathed flames was not a regular occurrence in the djinn world. About half ran for the exits, but the rest hoisted their weapons, looking more determined than ever. Not the Shafit man. He looked entirely bewildered. He gave Dara a searching look. I don't understand, he stammered as the ground started to rumble. Are you working with... The Shafit blacksmith was not similarly deterred. He raised an iron hammer and rushed forward. Dara had barely raised his scythe when an arrow slammed into the blacksmith's chest, followed swiftly by another tearing through his throat. Dara glanced back in surprise as trumpeting filled the air around them. A massive beast emerged from the gate leading to the bazaar, twice the size of a horse, with gray legs as thick as tree trunks. The creature flapped a pair of fan-like ears and raised its long trunk to let out another angry bellow. An elephant, Nahri realized. She had seen one once, on a private estate she had robbed. The elephant's rider ducked under the gate, a long silver bow in his hands. He coolly surveyed the chaos in the plaza. The archer appeared about her age. Not that that meant anything among the djinn. Dara could pass as a man in his 30s, and he was older than her civilization. The rider also looked Deva. His eyes and wavy hair were as black as hers, but he wore the same uniform as the Gaziri soldiers. He sat easily on the elephant, his legs propped up on a cloth saddle, his body swaying with the animal's movements. She saw him startle at the sight of the animated statues and raise his bow again before hesitating, likely realizing arrows were no match for the brass beasts. More soldiers poured out from other gates, pushing back the fleeing mob and fanning out to prevent any men from escaping. A coppery sword flashed and someone screamed. A trio of Gaziri soldiers advanced on Dara. The closest drew his weapon, and one of the lions bounded over, growling as it whipped a metal tail through the air. "Stop!" It was the archer. He quickly slid off the elephant, landing gracefully on the ground. "He's a slave, you fools. Leave him alone." He handed his bow to another man and then raised his hands as he approached them. "Please," he said, switching to Devasti. "I mean, you know." His gaze locked on the mark on Dara's temple. He made a small, choked sound of surprise. Dara did not look similarly impressed. His bright eyes scanned the archer from his gray turban to his leather slippers, and then he made a face as if he'd downed an entire carafe of sour wine. "Who are you?" My name's Jamshid." The archer's voice came out in a whisper of disbelief. "Jamshid-i Pramukh. Captain," he added in a stammer. His gaze darted between Dara's face and the cavorting lions. "Are you... it's not..." He shook his head, abruptly cutting himself off. "I think I should take you to meet my king." He glanced at Nahri for the first time. "Your... companion," he decided, "may join you as well if you desire." Dara twisted his scythe. "And should I desire to..." Nahri stomped hard on his foot before he could say something stupid. The rest of the soldiers were busy picking through the crowd, separating the men from the women and children, though Nahri saw some awfully young boys pushed up against the same wall as the men. Several were weeping, and a few were praying, dropped in such familiar prostration that she had to tear her eyes away from the sight. She wasn't sure what passed for justice in Daevabad, nor how the king punished people who insulted him and threatened another tribe, but from the doomed looks in the eyes of the men as they were rounded up, she could make plenty of guesses. And she didn't want to join them. She gave Jamshid the gracious smile through her veil. "Thank you for your invitation, Captain Pramukh. We would be honored to meet your king." "The fabric is too thick," Nahri complained. She sat back, letting the curtain go with a frustrated sigh. "I can't see anything." As she spoke, the palanquin that had been brought for them lurched forward and back, settling at an awkward angle that nearly spilled her into Dara's lap. "We are ascending the hill that leads to the palace," Dara said, his voice low. He rolled his dagger in his hands and stared at the iron blade, his eyes flashing. "Will you put that thing away? There are dozens of armed soldiers about. What are you going to do with that?" "I'm being delivered to my enemy in a floral box," Dara replied, and flicked the chintzy curtains with the dagger. I might as well be armed. Did you not say dealing with the djinn was preferable to being drowned by river demons? He threw her a dark look and continued to twirl the knife. To see a Deva man dressed like them, serving that usurper. He's not a usurper, Dara, and Jamshid saved your life. He did not save me, Dara replied, looking offended at the suggestion. He prevented me from permanently silencing that wretched man. Nahri let out an exasperated noise. And murdering one of the king's subjects on our first day in Daevabad would help us how? She asked. We're here to make peace with these people and find safe haven from the Ifrit, remember? Dara rolled his eyes. Fine, he sighed, toying with the dagger again. But truthfully, I did not mean to do that with the Shedu. The what? The Shedu, the winged lions. I wanted them to simply block the gate, but... He frowned, looking troubled. Nahri, I've felt strange since we entered the city, almost like... The carriage lurched to a stop, and Dara shut his mouth. The curtains were yanked open to reveal a still nervous-looking Jamshid-i Pramukh. Nahri ducked out of the litter, awed by the sight before her. Is that the palace? It had to be. She could scarcely imagine what other building could be so enormous. Sitting heavy on a stony hill above the city, Daevabad's palace was a massive edifice of marble, so big it blocked part of the sky. It wasn't particularly pretty, its main building a simple 6-level ziggurat that stretched into the sky. But she could see the outline of 2 delicate minarets and a gleaming golden dome tucked behind the marble wall, hinting at more grandeur beyond. A pair of golden doors were set in the palace walls, lit up by blazing torches. No, not torches. 2 more of the winged lions. Shedu, Dara called them, their brass mouths filled with fire. Their wings were poised stiffly over their shoulders, and Nahri suddenly recognized them. The tattooed wing on Dara's cheek crossed with the arrow, his Afshin symbol, the mark of service to the once royal Nahid family. My family. Nahri shivered, though the breeze was gentle. As they passed the torches, Dara suddenly leaned close to whisper in her ear. Nahri, it may be best if you remain vague about your background. You mean I shouldn't tell my ancestral enemy that I'm a liar and a thief? Dara inclined his head against hers, keeping his gaze forward. His smoky smell surrounded her, and her stomach gave an involuntary flutter. Say that the girl Basima's family found you in the river as a child, he suggested, that they kept you as a servant. Say you tried to keep your abilities hidden, and that you were just playing and singing with Basima when you accidentally called me." She gave him a pointed look. "And the rest of it?" One of his hands found hers and gave it a gentle squeeze. "The truth," he said softly. "As much as possible. I know not what else to say." Her heart sped as they entered a vast garden. Marble paths stretched out across the sunny grasses, shaded by manicured trees. A cool breeze brought the smell of roses and orange blossoms. Delicate fountains gurgled nearby, dappled by leaves and flower petals. The sweet trill of songbirds filled the air, along with the melody from a distant lute. As they approached, Nahri could see that the first level of the massive ziggurat was open on one side, with 4 rows of thick columns holding up the ceiling. There were flower-filled fountains set into the ground, and the marble floor was almost soft, perhaps worn down by millennia of feet. It was a white-veined green that resembled grass, bringing the garden indoors. Although the space looked big enough for thousands, Nahri guessed that there were fewer than 200 men there now, gathered around a stepped platform made of the same marble as the floor. It began to rise near the middle of the room, with its highest level meeting the wall opposite the garden. Nahri's gaze was immediately drawn to the figure at its front. The Djinn King lounged on a brilliant throne set with dazzling jewels and intricate stonework, power radiating off his bronze-brown skin. His ebony robes smoked and twirled at his feet, and a beautifully colored turban of twisting blue, purple, and gold silk crowned his head. But from the way everyone in the room lowered their heads in deference, he needed neither rich clothes nor throne to indicate who ruled here. The king looked like he'd once been handsome, but his graying beard and the paunch beneath his black robes attested to some age. His face was still sharp as a hawk's, however, his steel-colored eyes bright and alert. Intimidating. Nahri gulped and looked away to study the rest. Aside from a retinue of guards, there were 3 other men on the marble platform's upper levels. The first was older, with hunched shoulders. He looked Deva. A dark line of charcoal marked his golden-brown forehead. 2 more djinn were on the next platform. One sat on a plump cushion and was dressed similarly to the king, his curly black hair mussed and his cheeks slightly flushed. He rubbed his beard, absent-mindedly running his fingers around a bronze goblet. He was handsome, with an air of ease Nahri noticed was common in the rich and lazy, and bore a strong resemblance to the king. His son, she guessed. Her gaze paused at a heavy sapphire ring on his pinky. A prince. A younger man stood directly behind the prince, dressed in similar fashion to the soldiers, though his turban was a dark crimson instead of gray. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a severe expression on his narrow face. Though he shared the same luminous skin and peaked ears as purebloods, she had trouble identifying his tribe. He was nearly as dark as the Ayanle salt traders, but his eyes were the steely gray of the Gaziri. No one appeared to notice them. The king's attention was focused on a pair of bickering men below. He sighed and snapped his fingers. A barefoot servant greeted his outstretched hand with a goblet of wine. "It's a monopoly. I know more than one Tukharistani family weaves jade thread. They shouldn't be allowed to band together whenever they sell to an Agnivanshi merchant." A well-dressed man with long black hair crossed his arms. A line of pearls draped his neck, and two more encircled his right wrist. A heavy gold ring sparkled on one hand. "And how do you know that?" the other man accused him. He was taller and looked a bit like the Chinese scholars she'd seen in Cairo. Nahri edged past Dara, curious to get a better look at the men. "Admit it. You're sending spies to Tukharistan." The king raised a hand, interrupting them. "Didn't I just deal with the two of you? By the Most High, why are you still doing business with each other? Surely there are other—" He trailed off. The goblet fell from his hand as he stood, shattering on the marble floor, spatters of wine staining his robe. The hall fell silent, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes had locked on hers. Then a single word rushed from his mouth like a whispered prayer. "Manizheh?"